Imagine you're only 7 years old, running through your village somewhere in the Balkans, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of childhood. One day, strange men appear on the horizon, wearing heavy turbans and long, ornate robes. They didn't come for taxes or grain, they came for you, and you will never see your family again. For more than 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. It was a power that shaped the fate of millions. In the world's memory, it survives as a civilization of palaces, mosques, and mighty sultans. But behind that splendor lay darker mechanisms, systems that turned human bodies and minds into instruments of power. One of the most terrifying practices was the child levy, known as Devshirme, the so-called blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials moved through Christian villages, compiling registers. They knew exactly how many families lived there, how many boys were of the right age, and when the last child had been taken from that village. Every settlement had its number in the administrative books. The system ran with cold bureaucratic precision. Boys from 7 to 20 were the main targets, though the youngest were chosen most often. Sometimes 4-year-old toddlers were torn from their mother's arms. Officials measured height, checked health, and looked into their eyes like traders appraising horses. If a boy seemed sharp or unusually beautiful, his fate was already decided. Taken from their homes, the boys were sent to palace schools where their new life began. They learned Ottoman Turkish, Islam, discipline, and obedience. They were forbidden to speak their own language, to mention their parents, or even the names they were given at birth. Within months, their past disappeared. They became blank slates on which the empire inscribed its will. The brightest and most beautiful were sent to the Sultan's palace, prepared for service in the administration or in his private chambers. For some, life became something hard to describe today. Their bodies and minds were molded as tools, not only for labor, but for pleasure and control. They were raised to believe that serving power was the highest honor, even if it meant losing everything human. Those deemed strong and courageous entered the Janissary Corps, the elite of the Ottoman army. Yet even there, in a place of supposed honor, the system rested on total obedience and celibacy. Young warriors were to live without families or attachments, remaining completely devoted to the Sultan. What would be seen as aberrant in other cultures became normal here. Homoerotic relationships among Janissaries were accepted and even supervised by the state. At one point, a special unit, the so-called Knightly Battalion, was formed to maintain order among soldiers and regulate their intimate lives. In an army where emotions and longing could spark rebellion, even desire became a tool of discipline. The Ottoman system could subordinate every human need to power and control. But the true nightmare was only beginning. The most beautiful of the abducted boys were not trained for battle. They were destined for the court. These young, delicate captives became part of the harem, a world of closed doors, secrets, and quiet dramas. Some became dancers, others musicians, and still others attendants in chambers where no law applied, only the whims of the Sultan or his advisors. The cruelest fate awaited those chosen for castration. Despite religious prohibitions, procedures were carried out in Egypt or on Christian lands. The operations were primitive, without anesthesia, performed by men more afraid of angering their patrons than of killing a child. 9 out of 10 boys did not survive. Those who did became eunuchs, living guardians of the harem, symbols of absolute obedience. African boys who underwent total removal were called black eunuchs and were considered safe around the Sultan's women. They often rose to high positions, trusted in the most intimate spheres of the palace. European boys from the Balkans or Greece became white eunuchs, whose roles were confined mainly to administration, oversight of servants, and communication between palace quarters. None of them had a future. They could not marry, have children, or experience closeness. They lived to serve, dimmed halfway through life. In a world that glorified loyalty to power above all, even bodily mutilation was taken as a sign of devotion. Eunuchs were meant to be like shadows, without desire, identity, or will. And yet it was they who formed the backbone of the palace's inner power system. People stripped of their humanity became pillars of the empire. A different fate awaited the young dancers known as kocheks. They wore women's clothing, painted their faces, and danced at feasts and ceremonies. They were the toys of the elite, objects of desire, and symbols of a perverse power that could command anyone, even bodies dressed as women. Many spectators treated these performances as occasions for violence. European diplomats wrote of brawls, shouting, and even deaths during such spectacles. For boys dancing among drunken crowds, there was no protection. Their youth became a show. Over time, these customs were curbed, but only after generations of suffering. When we look today at palaces and minarets, it is hard to imagine that behind their beauty lie the stories of thousands of children who lost everything. Every slab of marble, every mosaic, may be a silent witness to their tragedy. What we call the Golden Age of the Ottoman Empire had a shadow, not recorded in chronicles of victory, but in the forgotten fate of abducted boys. For them, the empire was not a symbol of might, but the end of the world they knew. This is only the beginning, a story of how power could destroy innocence to preserve order. And what came next reveals an even darker face of human nature: state. Archives still hold ledgers that describe, without emotion, what for ordinary people was the end of the world. Registers of names, places of origin, height, age, and the assigned fate of boys torn from their families. Regulations for the levy and training, and instructions for officials conducting collections in Christian villages across the Balkans. They even recorded preferred recruitment regions for the inner palace school, where future courtiers and soldiers of the Sultan were trained, evidence of how minutely the selection and upbringing of palace pages were standardized. Hard bureaucracy smothered living tragedy. Mothers pleading for mercy, fathers powerless before armed guards, children forced to abandon language, faith, and even their own names, until their identities were remade from the ground up. From this recruitment machine emerged the Janissary Corps, an elite initially organized around strict discipline and a severing of family life, meant to forge loyalty to the Sultan alone. In the early centuries, practices bordered on monastic austerity, and the corps swelled or shrank with court policy, later evolving as abuses spread and regulations slackened, leading to partial departures from the original levy. At the same time, the system's ideologues justified it as punishment for peoples who had once resisted, and as a tool to create a new ruling class wholly dependent on the ruler's will. The most harrowing aspect of this world was the fate of boys sent to be castrated, destined to guard the palace's most secret spheres and to serve as intermediaries of power within the harem. Many accounts stress that full castration, removal of both penis and testicles, carried a dramatic risk of death, especially during healing or infection. That helps explain why procedure centers were located beyond strict legal and religious oversight, and why cost and risk were calculated as part of the production of eunuchs. Medical historians and comparative scholars note that mortality hinged on the type of procedure and hygiene conditions, with full castration bearing particularly high risk, as attested in descriptions by surgeons and in both Middle Eastern and European sources from the early modern period. Those who survived built careers on the trust of rulers. Black eunuchs, typically after full castration, had access to women's quarters and were often elevated to key posts, while white eunuchs more frequently held administrative and supervisory positions within the palace. Narrative sources and scholarly studies indicate that factional rivalry at court also ran through eunuchs' patronage networks. They could influence appointments, money flows, and decisions within ruling households, visible in accounts of conflicts around the most powerful sultan's mothers and grand viziers. Palace corridors became the arena of a quiet war of influence, where mutilated guardians gained enormous, paradoxical political agency, even as they had lost the most basic personal rights. Meanwhile, the trade in human beings expanded in parallel, supplying resources to palaces and to the homes of the wealthy, driven by a cold economic logic. Age, origin, beauty, and virginity affected price, and the market set rates according to utility and intended use. Research on a Mediterranean island shows that teenage girls and young women fetch the highest prices, and even within a single city, the cost of an enslaved woman could exceed the value of a large house, exposing the chilling scale of capital locked into human bodies. Literature also records purchases for the harem itself. Sums expressed in akçe and kuruş ranged widely, with beauty often deciding astronomical amounts that surpassed standard local market bands. In this structure, violence was not an aberration, but part of the order. Codes, taxes, and levies, such as the 1/5 share of booty, folded human beings into the circulation of property, turning the abducted into a steady revenue stream for the state and its intermediaries. Even the recovery of escapees was outsourced to private hunters who collected fees and settled expenses, showing that the surveillance apparatus over the enslaved rested on contracts and financial incentives. A mesh of taxes and licenses formed a system that normalized human trafficking in the everyday life of cities and provinces, from market squares to the quiet corners of palaces. Nor can we ignore the realm of spectacle, where sexual violence was sometimes framed as entertainment. Descriptions of performances by young dancers in gender-ambiguous costumes reveal audiences teetering between ecstasy and aggression, increasingly prompting public order responses and curbs on the custom. Contemporary studies of masculinity and discipline in the Ottoman army suggest that control over desires, bodies, and bonds became part of a political project to forge an obedient, chivalric soldierly identity, yet one coupled to coercion and structural violence. This duality, the elite rhetoric of honor alongside the practice of subjugation, laid the groundwork for loyalties meant to endure even in the face of mutiny and political upheaval. As the empire grew, the shadow of its institutions lengthened. For some, Devshirme meant advancement and access to the highest offices. For others, unimaginable loss and a rupture in communal continuity as generation after generation of boys vanished on the road to the capital. Sources emphasize that despite varied experiences, the system's function was to produce people entirely dependent on the court, from Janissaries to bureaucrats to eunuchs, providing rulers with a counterweight to a nascent aristocracy and local factions. The price of that loyalty was counted not only in coins and taxes, but in the memories of families who never saw their sons return. Within palace walls, the status of an enslaved woman was defined by the cold logic of law and economics. An owner's access to her body was treated as a property right, and any violation by third parties was described in the language of material damage, which in practice reduced the victim to the status of a thing. At the same time, imperial court practice rarely imposed the harshest penalties prescribed by religious law in matters of morality, creating space for intermediate punishments such as banishment, public humiliation, or administrative expulsion from neighborhoods. This mixture of statute and custom entrenched a dual track, lofty ideals on paper and flexible, often violent, solutions in everyday life. The harem, then, was not merely a place of fantasy. It was an institution where the interests of powerful court factions converged, and rivalry for access to the sultan created a web of patronage, denouncements, and abrupt downfalls. Studies of its structure show that education, discipline, and selection were carefully organized, and that women, from odalisques to the mothers of rulers, wielded real political influence, though their standing depended on the whims of the moment and the protection of formidable patrons. In such an order, the body, chastity, and birth became capital, played like pieces in an unending game for power and survival. Beyond the palace, the economy of enslavement flowed like a river with many branches: markets, brothels, private estates. And the residences of the powerful formed a chain of supply and demand in which people were priced by age, origin, and utility. In documents, the categories of virginity and ethnic origin recur as strong price drivers, directly shaping the strategies of brokers and abductors. By collecting taxes and regulating the circulation of property, the state folded these practices into the normality of big cities and their hinterlands. The realm of public punishment was part of the politics of order. Sources indicate that moral offenses and prostitution were punished mainly with administrative measures, though authorities periodically resorted to spectacular acts of humiliation and coercion, especially in times of tension and religious rigor. In the wider panorama of the Islamic world, descriptions of torture and executions show how punishment became spectacle, with choreographed gestures, processions, and displays of moral authority designed to teach obedience through fear. This model, performance instead of justice, cemented the social message that the subjects' bodies belonged to power, and that shame and pain were instruments of rule. All of this etched deep scars into collective memory. In Balkan communities, the absence of returning sons became the subject of songs, mourning, and warnings to future generations, while in the empire cities, the daily traffic in human beings blended into the rhythm of markets, taxes, and devotions. Devshirme, the harem, and slave markets formed a system of communicating vessels, recruitments, trainings, sales, and promotions that manufactured loyalty subordinated to the court while cementing hierarchies based on origin, gender, and age. Understanding this machinery is key to grasping how the empire maintained cohesion for centuries, shaping intimacy, violence, and the economy into a single, pitiless mechanism. The fall of the empire did not bring an immediate end to practices that had bound violence to economics and politics for centuries. It was rather a long twilight of transition in which old mechanisms unraveled unevenly, their echoes still audible in archives, customs, and collective memory. The decline of the boy levy stretched across centuries, and the fading of Devshirme did not mean the end of bondage. The trade in human beings and domestic servitude survived in other forms until the region's legal and political order changed. This inertia shows how deeply control over bodies and the disciplining of souls had grown into institutions meant to last as long as the state endures. Only a rapid sequence of events in the first decades of the 20th century closed the era. The occupation of the capital, the war for Anatolia's independence, the decision by the Grand National Assembly to formally abolish the Sultanate, and finally the telling scene: the last sultan leaving the city as the old power was pushed into history. Abolishing the Sultanate on the first day of November 1922 and the departure of Mehmed VI from Constantinople ended the political continuity of a dynasty that for more than 6 centuries had decided the fate of millions. The dates may seem dry, but in those moments the world of institutions that subordinated intimacy to state purpose came to an end. When the drums and banners fell silent, traces remained. Account books, registers, letters, materials recording names, origins, and the prices of human beings, now scattered across archives, library stacks, and private collections. Studies of the collapse and the reforms show that an empire's story doesn't end with a single date, but with a chain of decisions, failures, and modernization attempts that brought palace corridors crashing against a modern state. What once passed for order under the pressure of new ideas and wars revealed its fragility and its inhuman cost. Today's archaeology and heritage conservation keep uncovering fragments of that civilization. Valuable finds from garrisons, palaces, residential quarters, and sites of symbolic power that fill gaps in the record and let us read more precisely the material imprint of dominion over bodies and space. Across much of Central and Southeastern Europe, research at early modern sites sheds light on penal practices, logistics, and the war economy, confirming that the apparatus of violence also had architectural and urban form. These finds correct our memory. They add what chronicles left unsaid, the things that can be read in walls, refuse and discarded objects. For a modern audience, the hardest part may be reconciling two images: a civilization that raised dazzling mosques, aqueducts, and bridges, and a system that taught society to treat the human body as a commodity and intimacy as an extension of politics. That dissonance does not vanish with moral judgment. On the contrary, it demands an awareness that long-lasting institutions create habits and languages that can outlive regime changes and centuries. This is why remembrance of the victims is not merely a matter of the past, but a test of our vigilance against new versions of old mechanisms. If this story teaches anything, it is that civilization crumbles where the state seizes what is most intimate: language, name, childhood, bodies, and rephrases it in the language of law, economics, and order. Devshirme, the harem, markets, and public punishments were parts of a single system that processed people into instruments of loyalty, profit, and fear, and operated for as long as archives and consciences stayed silent. Today, the duty is to read those records to the end, to call things by their names, and to defend the principle that human dignity is neither negotiable nor subject to exception.